Okay, I just got the recording started, so we will record. I'm going to mute myself, but I will chime in here and there, perhaps when I have something helpful to share. But Johnny, thanks so much for being part of our Board Leadership Collaborative and our Board Skill Up program. We appreciate the partnership with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Always a pleasure to work with Leadership Tulsa. And again, thanks to ONEOK. We have a great relationship with Typros as well, all of the sponsors and groups that are involved. I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. I always like to give everybody a heads up because I know sometimes there's some resizing issues. But we'll share the screen. Then I'm going to adjust my screen so I can see everybody's faces as well as the material I'm presenting. And as you guys can see, top 10 practices for boards presented to, because I'm a member of LT64, the second greatest class ever. And no, don't get your works up. We're just so good, they gave us the top 2 spots. That's why I put second greatest and not just greatest. So everybody, fair warning that we're going to take up the top 2. If anyone has any questions at any point, do put them in the chat. Wendy's going to be monitoring that for us. I have asked her specifically, hey, please provide insight and comments on any questions that we have. And what we're doing tonight is just when you're going to enter your board service now through Leadership Tulsa or at any point in your career, or if you're currently involved with board service, I wanted to give everybody a few theoretical concepts they can try to put into play, as well as some actual real world changes they can make instantly at your next board meeting to help be the best board member you can be, which would help your organization be the best that it could be. So with that in mind, a brief overview of myself. I've been with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits since 2018. Prior to that, I spent about 25 years in the entertainment industry here in Tulsa. So if you ever went to a show at the Brady Theater or the Maybe Center or the BOK Center, it was probably one of mine. I was a concert promoter and a venue manager. And then for about the last 10 years of my career, I was a tour manager for Chris Christopherson and BB King and Chuck Berry. And I realize when I say those 3, most people probably haven't even heard of them because I'm so old. But they were all, we had a country, a blues, and a rock and roll artist that I got to tour with. Then in 2010, when my daughter was born, I said, I don't want to be on the road 49 weeks a year. And I've always been attracted to the nonprofit sector. I'd worked on the board of the Greenwood Cultural Center when I was running the Brady Theater, and they asked me to come work for them. So I worked for the Greenwood Cultural Center as their first director of development, as well as the first non-person of color that they had ever hired. After about 2 years there, planting the seeds for the Greenwood Rising Project, I went to work with a group called New Hope, Oklahoma, which helps children of incarcerated parents. And I was their executive director for a few years. And then in 2018, I came to work here at the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. As Wendy mentioned, I am in the Tulsa office. I'm also the only person who does training and consulting. Most of our folks kind of fall on one side of the fence or the other, but I'm in the classroom quite a bit. If not, I'm delivering presentations like these or strategic planning or some of the same stuff that Wendy does. So if you have any questions about anything in the nonprofit sector related to today's presentation or not, please don't hesitate to reach out and follow up with me. I'll give you my contact information at the end. So before we start, most people, when I ask the question, how many nonprofits do we have in the state of Oklahoma? They tell me they think we have anywhere from 500, 2,000, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 nonprofits. But the fact of the matter is, we actually have 22,000 nonprofits in the state of Oklahoma. We're not the strongest in terms of percentage or population density. We don't have the most nonprofits. Vermont does. They have more nonprofits than any other state. And we're not the least. That would be Utah. They have the least nonprofits in terms of per capita. But we're right about in the middle. And 22,000 nonprofits means we employ more people than the oil and gas sectors combined. That's the power of the sector that we have. We may not have the same financial impact. Our impact is about $4 to $5 billion each year, but we do have the numbers to support it. Most of those nonprofits, about 80% of them, or 75 to 80%, are split between the 2 metro areas of Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and the rest truly are scattered throughout the state. We're a state association, the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. That means I get to work with all 22,000 nonprofits. And in that time, I've seen virtually every type of nonprofit issue I think you could have. From, I have my smallest client is the Donkey Dairy Association. Has anybody ever heard of the Donkey Dairy Association? I'm not making that up. It really is a group. The Donkey Dairy Association is a nonprofit. Their annual budget is $317. And all they do all day, every day is milk donkey. I didn't even know you could milk a donkey. They milk donkeys and they give the donkey milk to hospitals because donkey milk fights autoimmune diseases in children in ways that medicine can't, in a very organic and natural way. So my smallest client is then my largest client is probably Feed the Children. Their annual budget is just under $1 billion. It's about 980 million now, which means their annual budget is larger than either of the metro areas that I referenced earlier. And they all have the same issues and have the same concerns and have the same practices that try to put into place, which we're going to talk about today. I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember the Late Show with David Letterman. That was a big thing when I was growing up. And David Letterman would do his top 10 list. He'd read off a top 10 list each night. And he'd always pick, he'd say the home office, and he'd pick a small random town that no one had ever heard of. And I remember I was so proud, my junior and senior year of high school back in the 80s, that's how long ago this was, David Letterman's home office was Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And none of my friends had heard of Tahlequah, Oklahoma, but I had been there several times. So I decided that we'd do things in a top 10 list of how to approach this. So what we're going to be talking about is 10 things you can do as a board member, and hopefully your board should be doing to ensure that you're having some great practices and some best practices in place. First and foremost, 10 best board practices. Number 1, recruit a supportive, committed, and diverse board. And I will tell you, when we went through and we was making this specific list up, I update the list about every 2 to 3 years, just like a nonprofit would with their bylaws. We intentionally chose the language that we use here. Recruit is something you do with intention. We're not asking random strangers to sign up and give board service. We're specifically saying we have a need we need to fill, just as an athletic team or a college recruiter or a executive recruiter, headhunter would do. And we want folks who are supportive and committed and diverse. Now, the fact of the matter is most boards in the state of Oklahoma are the 3 Ales: pale, male, and stale. That's just how we tend to operate. We all talk about how important diversity is, but until you want to put your money where your mouth is and put it into practice, you're not going to be as successful as you can be. Virtually every study since 1983 has proven conclusively, statistically, and scientifically that organizations with higher levels of diversity are far more successful than organizations without. So when we say, hey, you need to recruit a board that's supportive and committed and diverse, all 3 of those words are just as important. I can tell you horror stories of folks going out and saying, our bylaws dictate that we have to have at least 11 board members. We had 13, but 3 quit. I need to go out and find another board member. And they recruit somebody and put them in a spot and are shocked when things go wrong. In fact, as a consultant, I have to tell people what they need to hear, not necessarily what they want to hear. And more than once, I've had to say, you can't be surprised if you hire dumb people and dumb decisions get made. That's just going to happen. But if you take the intentionality and you take the commitment and you're deliberate in your recruiting process, then great things will tend to happen. So step number 1, recruit a supportive, committed, and diverse board. And if you're not sure, feel free to ask your board when you start your service, do we have a diversity policy? Do we know what the board members are made up of? Do we know, and by diversity, we're not simply talking ethnic background or racial history. We're talking everything from political ideologies and religious preferences to gender identity or sexual orientation. Is the deaf community represented? Is communities of all ages and all geographic regions and all different socioeconomic backgrounds, are they represented? Because most of the nonprofits you're going to work with have missions that exceed every demographic line you can think of. So number 1, recruit a supportive, a committed, and a diverse board.
A lot of boards who have problems getting quorums, that's a really good sign that people have, for whatever reason, gotten less supportive and committed as well. And sometimes you can look at your board meeting practices and find out if people feel like their time is well spent. But it can also tell you that you've got people who have moved on or were not that committed. So I think that's a really great signal of a committed board, is that people are actually showing up when there's work to do.
Very true. Statistically speaking, the number 1 reason people join boards is not because they have a connection to the cause, it's to pad their resume. And the number 2 reason is not because they have a connection to the cause, it's peer pressure. So Amy asked me and I didn't want to say no to Amy, so I joined a board. There's not really an investment or a connection. I just like Amy and I'm a fan, so I wanted to make things work.
I'd like to reframe that too, that sometimes if there's someone you respect and admire asks you to get involved, you feel flattered. And
exactly right.
Yes, but I think you're right. People get involved because of who asks them as often, if not more often, than what they get involved with. So I think that's a great point.
Very true. And no more so than here in our metro areas, especially Tulsa. They say there's like 1 million people in the greater Tulsa. There's like 319, and we all know each other. I promise that's how it works. So get ready, it's going to happen quite a bit. Number 2, establish board member expectations and term limits. You'll see the Dilbert cartoon in front of you say, and it's a joke about how are those expectations you knew nothing about going. And Dilbert says, oh, we're killing him. It happens all the time. I will tell you guys now, in a professional relationship, in a personal relationship, in a spiritual relationship, emotional, romantic, whatever relationship, unspoken expectations are rarely ever going to get met. And when somebody says, hey, I'm interested in joining your board, what would that entail? I tell people, over communicate every expectation on the planet. Hey, I think Jason would be a great board member. Jason, this is what it entails. We have 6 meetings each year. You need to attend 4 of those in person. 1 can be virtual. You can miss 1. You need to attend some of our training events. You need to attend our fundraisers. You need to support financially. You need to let us have access to your network in terms of fundraising. You need to, you need to, you need to. And in return, we will do this and we will do that. We will be committed to our own cause. Not only does it eliminate the situation of, oh, I had no idea that was expected of me, but it lets people know, hey, our board only has 13 seats available, and we need 13 serious people to address this problem. We want to make it very clear up. Wouldn't that be great if I tell people board service, it's like a dating app these days. Wouldn't it be great if everybody had to actually be honest on a dating app or any social media for that, like it was impossible to lie? You'd know everything up front and life would be so much easier for us. So, hey, here's what we're expecting up front. The concept of term limits, that goes back to that concept of diversity. I have a lot of organizations who will reach out to me, say, Johnny, we haven't had any growth in 20 years. We don't know what we're doing wrong. And I look at their board and they say, well, Amy's been on the board 19 years and Jason's been on the board 14 years and Rebecca's been on the board 21 years and Dylan's been on the board 19 years. And I said, well, there's part of your problem. You can't have the same train of thought and expect different results. I think it was Einstein is often the one most credited with saying insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. When you have term limits, you're forcing your board to think long-term, to think, is the board going to be stronger 10 years from now when I'm not here? And what are we going to do? I know the example everybody always gives is, what if Grant were to be hit by a bus tomorrow? And I think that's the most macabre analogy. I say, what if Grant won the lottery and moved to Mexico tomorrow morning? You know, he's never heard. We don't hear from Grant anymore at all. Would we still be able to function as we want to? Because we know that there's a constant influx of talent through our recruitment strategy that we have. Now, a lot of organizations are very hesitant to term limits. And I tell them there's a couple of reasons we do this. First and foremost, if your entire mission model revolves around one person, it's not going to be successful, I promise you. That's not how nonprofit organizations work. Number 2, anything can happen to anybody. You guys remember like back in February, well, a year ago this month now, we all thought this COVID thing would be done by probably spring break. And even our approach to our communication was different. We log on 10 minutes early and we cared about what was behind us and we made sure our hair was good. Right now, most of you aren't even wearing pants because it's become a part of our cultural embrace. That's what we do. And if you're taking that concept of, hey, we're setting expectations and we're constantly looking for somebody who can make this a better situation via term limits, then your board is by default going to be much more effective and much more efficient than they would be without.
It also forces you to build your leadership bench. So if people can't serve forever, you're constantly bringing in new talent and building that talent so they'll be ready to lead. And that makes a stronger organization too.
Exactly right. Thank you for saying it that way, Wendy. That's perfect. The leadership bench, I love that. It certainly does. Number 3, develop conflict of interest and confidentiality policies and disclosures for board members. I apologize for the typo, for board members. So here's what gets a lot of boards and organizations they serve into trouble. It's not even a conflict of interest, it's a perceived conflict of interest. Now, a conflict can go down a couple different ways. First and foremost, we'll say Rebel is the executive director of an ABC nonprofit. She decides to hire her entire family at $250,000 a year, even though our entire budget is only $500,000 a year. That's not only poor leadership, that's a very direct conflict because Rebel's hiring her family. Sometimes, though, it's not as direct. We'll say Jennifer is serving on a board and of an organization that has a big event each year, and they buy t-shirts to help promote this event. And the t-shirts cost the organization $15. Well, Jennifer joins the board and she owns a t-shirt shop. She can get the t-shirts for $10. But if we give the contract to Jennifer, she's getting a benefit from that, which you can't do as a board member. So it's a conflict. Do we spend more money on the t-shirts, having less money for our mission, or do we save money, but one of our board members benefits from that? Now, Jennifer's going to say, I'll do it at cost. Well, she's still getting bulk purchase discounts. She's still getting better enhancement in the food. She's still benefiting. It doesn't have to be financial. That's a conflict of interest. And how that's handled is pretty simple, just so you guys are aware. When the situation's brought up, Jennifer raises her hand and she says, hey, I'm a conflicted party here. I need to recuse myself from the boardroom. Jennifer literally gets up and leaves the room so far away that she can't see or hear the discussion in real time. That's the legal threshold. And she's gone for the discussion and the decision. Once the decision's made, Jennifer comes back in. Hey, Jennifer, we're giving you the contract. Her recusal, her departure for discussion decision, her return is all noted in the board meeting minutes. And then it's not a conflict. But when people don't disclose a conflict, then it becomes usually a PR nightmare in a worst case scenario, as well as funders wanting to back away and not support your organization, et cetera. So make sure your organization not only has a conflict of interest policy, which by the way, the IRS requires, but they also have a confidentiality policy because board business can only be discussed and decided during board meetings. So those meetings after the meeting in the parking lot for every board that anybody's ever served on really shouldn't be happening. But you need to understand as a board member, I can't discuss board business outside. Now, certain decisions you obviously want to operate transparently. Certain decisions you do need to share with the public. A good guideline, decisions that are being made are confidential. Decisions that have been made can usually be shared with the public. But in some cases, there is a confidentiality need, mergers, acquisitions, dissolutions, et cetera. So keep in mind, conflict of interest, confidentiality policies are two things all boards should have in place. If you join a board and they're not asking you for a conflict of interest disclosure statement to be filled out, please ask them, hey, do you have a conflict of interest disclosure statement? I'd like to make sure I serve on other boards. I do contracts with other businesses that give to this organization. I need to make sure they're disclosed.
Hey, Johnny, can I add one other thing? So the
Yes,
legal conflict of interest is really around financial interests. But what I always like people to raise and think about too is sometimes we're involved in more than one organization. And even if we don't personally have any financial interest involved in any of them, we have to remember when we're at the board table, we're trying to make the decision that's best for that organization we're sitting at. And if you're feeling pulled in more than one direction because you have more than one set of loyalties, that's also, I think, a time for you to raise the fact that you're maybe not disinterested or that you have different perspectives. And you have to remember as you're sitting at that table, you're really thinking about what's good for that organization. Exactly right.
There's also, you may hear the expression conflict of emotion, which is kind of really starting to take effect. A perfect example of this, one of our member organizations that I have as a consulting client is an organization designed to help parents who have a child who's been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And the entire board is made up of those parents. And I asked them point blank, again, and sometimes I have to say what people need to hear. I said, you're making a decision. Everyone in this room has either just lost a child, is losing a child, or just found out they're going to lose a child. And I don't think you're in the best emotional state to look at anything objectively or make long-term decisions. And they realized while they did need to have the parents' input on the situation, maybe it would be best to bring in somebody who could be a little bit more objective all the time. So conflicts aren't just financial, as Wendy said, although that is usually the default reaction we think of when we think of conflicts. Number 4, populate an active committee structure with non-board members who can bring additional skills to your organization. So we chose the language in this sentence for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, the committees are the workhorses of the boards. That's just a fact. Strong boards don't have weak committee structures. Strong boards have great committee structures who do the work of the board for the most part. As an example, the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, we're a statewide association, thousands of members. We have a 35-person board that meets 4 times a year for 90 minutes. And people say, how can you get a lot done 4 times, in 6 hours a year? We don't. The committees meet in the intervening months, and they're the ones doing everything from budget recommendations to capital campaign, finance, research, to deciding, hey, we need a new building, we need a fleet of cars, we want to offer insurance to our employees, whatever it may be. The committees are the ones doing that work. Remember, when board meetings are called to order, only board business can be discussed, and they can't be discussed after the meetings are adjourned. So you want a lot of that work happening in the committees. And the reason I chose the graphic that you guys see in front of you is not because I like the way it's laid out or even that I prefer rectangles over circles. It's that the committee members at the bottom are the biggest block. And in a true healthy organization, those committee structures are going to be crucial to success. And just as importantly, what a lot of folks don't realize, especially if they're early on in their board service, you don't have to be on the board to serve on a committee. Usually it's recommended that your governance committee is the only committee made up of board members, but the rest will have a board member liaison. But if you don't have 15 marketing experts on your board, maybe you have a marketing committee where folks can come and offer their expertise. Not only is it a great chance to kind of test drive a board member and see if they show up to meetings and if they're enthusiastic and if they're connected, if they do what they say they're going to do, maybe they'll be a good board member. But it's also a great way, a perfect example. I have a consulting client who is getting ready to build a new building. And I said, it may be a good idea to have somebody with some building experience weighing in on this. And the thought hadn't crossed their mind because they had other issues to be concerned about. And I said, but once the building's done, you won't need that experience. So why don't we create a building committee? That way we have this great wealth of knowledge that's at our disposal for 2 or 3 years, whatever the timeline may be. And then when the project is done, the committee isn't committed to a long-term time commitment unless they're interested. You're not committed to a relationship unless you're interested, and it's a win-win for everybody. So remember, those workhorses of the boards truly are the committees. And every nonprofit I work with, from $317 a year for their budget to $980 million a year for their budget, all have strong committee structures if they're successful organizations. And I know Leadership Tulsa does. I'll vouch for that personally. Any questions so far?
Note in the chat that sometimes organizations, as they evolve and change, to your point, that they sometimes need to reevaluate their committee structure. And I'd say our organization is a little bit at one of those points where one of my goals and hopes for my board this year is that we take a step back and look at that committee structure because we've evolved so much.
Yeah, and the committee structure is a lot like the concept of term limits. Holy cow, Jacqueline's been serving she founded the organization. She's been with us 35 years. Chances are Jacqueline can't be making the same contributions she made 35 years ago. And I promise you the organizational needs aren't the same as they were 3.5 decades ago. And it can be a tough decision to make sometimes. And I promise you, with regard to the specific example I'm using, Jacqueline, founder syndrome is a very real thing. You can Google it and kind of read up on it. But sometimes a nonprofit organization is almost like somebody's passion project. I've heard people say, my organization is like my child. That's how important it is to me. And having to distance yourself from that, even if it means for the betterment of the organization long-term, can be a difficult decision. So keep that in mind. And again, sometimes the best way to test those board service waters is to build a strong committee structure. Number 5, design a recruitment strategy and board succession plan. So in a nutshell, if I know that Clay is going to be leaving the board in a year and Clay has brought so much knowledge and expertise to our board, I'm probably going to want to start recruiting somebody as far in advance as I can to make sure that Clay's needs that he is leaving, the institutional knowledge he's taking with him and the experiences aren't quite lost. The problem most boards run into, and I'm just going to be completely honest here, they get a great board put together and they think, we've got a great board, our problems are over. And I will tell you this, I share this story with virtually every class. If you guys can see that picture right up on that wall, that's a guy named Lindsey Buckingham. If you don't know who Lindsey Buckingham is, Lindsey was the singer and songwriter and lead guitarist for a group called Fleetwood Mac, which in the 70s and 80s was huge. They were massive. And the reason that picture's up on my wall, I saw an interview with Lindsey, like on VH, is VH1 even still around? Like it was on VH1 or one of these things where you still had to watch commercials. And they said, hey, how did you approach this album Rumors, which is Fleetwood Mac's biggest selling album? And Lindsey said something that was so impactful to me, I literally asked him to write it down so I could hang it up in my office. He said, if you're any good at all, you know you can be better. And that's the approach board members have to take. Hey, we're good as a board, but we can be better. We can be more diverse, more supportive, more committed. We can be stronger financially. We can have a better breadth of experience. We can be more, you can be more of any of the good things, but you're not going to get there unless you have some intentionality behind it. So the purpose of a governance committee is not just to say, hey, Michelle, you made a pledge that you haven't given to the organization yet, or hey, Rebecca, you haven't showed up for the last 3 meetings. We need to roll you off the board. But the purpose of the governance committee is to say, hey, these terms are going to be up in a year. We need to start thinking of somebody who can fill these spots even stronger than Clay did in the example I used earlier. And if you don't have a board succession plan in place or a recruitment strategy, there's no time like the present to come up with one. At the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, we can help you do that. Wendy can help you do that. She's built a great board, and it hasn't been by accident. Great boards are like great kids. They don't just happen. They happen through intentionality and through proper action and through strong leadership and guidance. That's how they tend to happen. So keep that in mind. Once you get a great board in place, you're not just riding the wave till you hit the shoreline. You have to keep working so you can be better in the future than you are right now.
There was a direct question to me about these committees we're talking about, if they're made up of volunteers or staff. And I thought that might be great to raise. So there's 2 organization structures in a nonprofit. There's the board with the board president and the officers and the committees, and that was the organization chart you showed. And some small nonprofits are all volunteer, and that is the organization structure. So the committees typically are made up of volunteers. When organizations get really large, like the one that you were talking about, Feed the Children with $1 billion, or even much smaller than that, there's often tasks that need more daily focus than a set of all volunteers can do. And so they begin to hire staff. And there's a different staff structure, which includes an executive director or a CEO, and then the staff that report up to that person, with the board hiring that CEO. So sometimes there'll be staff members assigned to work with committees, but the committees actually report up to the board president and to the officers of the board. And there's more of a collaborative relationship between staff and board. And that's true in the board nominating situation too. Sometimes boards just want to leave it to their executive director to find board members and bring them on board. And it's really important that the board members themselves take an active role in growing and building their board.
Exactly right. And as Wendy said, it's not uncommon for staff to work with committees. That does not mean staff does the work of committees. I've never met, and in thousands of nonprofits I've worked with, I've never met a single nonprofit employee who said, you know what, I've got too much time. Like I've got time to kill. Give me more to do. It never happens that way. Working for a nonprofit is like having kids. There's never enough time and there's never enough money. That's just how it tends to go. So make sure when you're in that position where you're saying, hey, we finally have some staff in place and we are finally at a place where we can have a strong committee structure, you're not just saying, well, so-and-so gets a paycheck anyway, he or she can do that, because they have their own plates that they got to keep spinning in the air, and the committee will be bringing a whole different set of skills. That's a great point, Wendy. Thank you. Number 6, invest in board training and facilitation for strategic planning. So here's what I used to call a life hack, but my daughter calls it pro tip. Here's the pro tip. Really good nonprofit organizations have a line item in their budget for staff development. But really great nonprofit organizations have a line item for board development too. So I know it's a funny concept. In the 1955, when the tax reform code was passed, we said we're going to take this for-profit business model and apply a board to nonprofit organizations. But the fact is, boards don't always have all the answers. I don't know of any single individual I've met who had all the answers, and they need to develop their skills as a board and as board members. So invest in that training. And there's a slew in the state of Oklahoma alone of organizations that offer great training. The second part of that, of course, is invest in some facilitation for strategic planning. So this is the reason that we include this. A strategic plan is a kind of a blueprint for an organization's development, usually over 3 to 5 or maybe 7 years. I do know of one fairly large family foundation whose strategic plan is literally hundreds of years in advance, but most of us don't have $20 billion in holdings or whatever it is that they have. So a strategic plan says, hey, here's what we're going to do to move forward. Now, if the board could be objective enough to make the decisions and was great at facilitating and mining for conflict to make sure all perspectives were brought in, you wouldn't need a strategic plan to begin with. But as human beings, we're flawed. We have our own biases. We have our own perspectives, our own experiences. So what we do is we say, hey, bring in somebody out externally who's objective. We do it at the center. Wendy actually does quite a bit of strategic planning facilitation. And it truly is the difference between what I call a C- strategic plan and the A+ strategic plan that everybody wants to get the answers off of. That's the frustrating part, is people see a very strong strategic plan and they're like, oh, we can take this and apply it to our organization. And I have to explain to them, if you've seen one nonprofit, you've seen one nonprofit. They're all completely different. And there's no magic footprint or template or cookie cutter approach that's going to work. But if you have somebody who's strong in strategic planning facilitation, and you have somebody who understands, hey, boards need to be developed as well, it's going to be a very, very positive thing for your board and for your organization. Number 7, and actually Wendy referenced this earlier, evaluate your board through personal and group self-assessments. So the cartoon there says, this is interesting, 70% of our respondents to our survey say they don't respond to surveys. If you've ever done anything with a nonprofit organization, you've gotten a survey at some point, right? That's how we do things. Hey, we need to measure our outputs and our outcomes, make sure we're having mission fulfillment. We do a lot of surveys. But again, one of those kind of life hacks is that smart boards assess themselves as board members. I always give this example. Back in the early 90s, I was at OU Medical School. I was originally going to have a career in medicine. And the time came for my first evaluation, and I went to my supervisor and I said, hey, I need you to fill out my evaluation. And she said, and I quote, I don't have time for this, flung it back at me and said, fill it out yourself. So I said, okay, exceeds expectations, exceeds expectations, exceeds expectations, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, all the way down. And I brought it back to her and I said, hey, I have my evaluation. And she said, before I look at that, let me ask you this. Did you go through and give yourself a 5 out of 5 on everything without thinking about it? Or did you understand people are literally putting their lives in your hands? And you need to be as committed and as focused and as determined as you possibly can be if you want those people to even have a chance of survival, much less thriving. And I said, can I have that back, please? And I went back and I sat down and I asked myself some pretty tough questions. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying after each board meeting, give somebody a 15-page survey they have to fill out. But I do recommend each board doing 3 assessments a year. The first one is simple. And if you've ever been to a hospital, you've seen what I call the pain scale, where on one end is a smiley face, and on the other one, put 5 smiley faces on there, just have a board member circle it as they go out. If you have 15 board members and 11 of them had pain faces, then it probably wasn't a good experience for them. The second one is where board members have to assess the job they're doing. Hey, is Jason Simpson being the best board member he can be? Is Grant Maxey bringing everything to the table he can bring? Is he participating? Is he supporting? Is he volunteering? Is he speaking up when he has questions and speaking up when he has opinions? And if not, then why not? If you're not engaged, if you're not committed and connected to an organization, I wouldn't want to waste your time any more than I'd want to waste my own. And again, we only have a limited number of seats. So are you being the best board member you can be? And if not, can we as a board support you in that to develop that? And then the last assessment we recommend everybody do once a year is, as a board, not you as an individual, but as a group, are we doing the best we can do? Do we understand the issues that our organization is facing? Do we understand the daily operations? Do we know what our organization needs to be successful next year, next decade, next century in some cases? And once you get those assessments, here's the secret ingredient. Actually read them. I promise you, someday Nat Geo is going to do a special on the Bermuda Triangle, and at the bottom they're going to find 15,000 surveys nobody ever bothered to read. If you're getting feedback from somebody who's gracious enough to donate their time and who you intentionally recruited because you want their insight, read it and listen to it. Because when you do, you're going to realize we can be a much better organization than we're being right now. So board assessments are a good idea.
Johnny, I told the group I would send out a sample one that I have with the notes. If you have any you really like, I'd love to see them. And then Tracy Spears, who we've worked with a lot from the Exceptional Leaders Lab, she has in her book something she calls an I value you conversation for your team members. And I got to thinking while you were talking, I wonder if that could be reworked just a little bit if we're having an I value you conversation with board members.
It probably could be. You know, it's funny. One of my newest clients is the Micronesian Coalition, which is based out of Edmond, and they taught me the concept of Yakwe, which is how Micronesians greet each other. Yakwe simply means Ya is you and Kwe is rainbow. And it's a greeting saying, hey, you bring the light and the colors into my life. Without you, I wouldn't have the life that I have in a positive way. And I thought, man, if we could take that concept to board serve, that same concept, I value you. And I want you to value yourself. And I want us all to value you and be as inclusive as possible. Holy cow, the sky's the limit. So keep that in mind. That is the self-assessments, board assessments, and even the quick smiley, frowny face assessments are often tools for great feedback. Number 8, support the CEO and provide a performance evaluation each year. So the best example I give of this literally happened to me last month. I was speaking with somebody, I'll pick on Linda because I see her name on the screen in front of me. And I said, Linda, how was your last CEO annual evaluation? And she said, my board's a little bit behind. They were supposed to evaluate me in October of 2016. And I said, you've been on more than 4 years and you haven't had an evaluation? She said, no. They said, good job, keep it up, you're doing fine. And we move forward. And I say, first of all, your definition of fine and my definition of fine are probably drastically different. My fiance and I are building a house right now. And I want everybody to take just a second and picture my house in your head. I've given you no information whatsoever, but you have a pretty clear picture of a house in your head right now. Probably doesn't match the one I'm building, but it matches the one in your head. It goes back to the expectations we talked about earlier. If your executive director or president and CEO, your organizational leader, isn't on the same page in terms of goals and how to achieve them and how to measure outcomes, then you're not only doing a disservice to the organization, you're doing a disservice to that leader as well. But most boards, an astoundingly high number of boards, simply say, we're doing fine, we don't need to go in and have a conversation or him. And I will make this point very clear. Here at the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, annual compensation is not tied into performance evaluation at all. One's a budgetary issue that's tied into job descriptions. The other is saying, hey, how'd you do this last year? What surprised you? What are you proud of? What are your goals for the next year? How can I help you achieve those goals? I will tell you full disclosure. One of my goals 2 years ago was for us to have the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits have a great relationship with Leadership Tulsa. And I said, they've got this awesome board intern program and they're just doing great things and they're not going away. And I'd love to do that. And we finally had some meetings where we sat down and we said, we think we can bring this. And Wendy said, this is what we're looking for. And it makes sense. But if we hadn't had that communication as to what the same goals were, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now. The same principle applies. So if you're on a board, don't hesitate to say, when did we last have an evaluation? And I'd like to chime in on that. Even if chiming in is, I don't work with Dylan on a regular basis, but I've heard that he's doing good things. He seems to be popular with the staff. I know we've grown financially. And more importantly, if you haven't ever worked with your executive director and you're on a board, that's a pretty good indication that there's a good time to reach out and make a phone call, grab a lunch, grab a cup of coffee, have a distanced Zoom virtual meeting. A lot of board members say, oh, I've never met the executive director. I said, you've been on the board 4 years and you've never met your executive director? No. I said, there's a whole different cultural question we need to talk about. But you want to make sure those evaluations are getting done because, again, it's not fair to the executive director and it's not fair to the organization.
So Johnny, one thing that I will raise is that as people are going out into board internship positions or they're new board members, they may not actually be aware whether this is happening or not. Often it's at the executive committee level that this is happening. Sometimes there's some sort of a board survey. But as you move into an officer position, that's really when I think you would want to be thinking about, you know, are we doing this? Are we doing this in an appropriate way? And I'd put 4 questions in the chat that are my favorite questions for any kind of evaluation. You can dress it up a lot, but they're kind of the 4 key questions that anybody I think would want feedback on regarding their performance.
And I will tell you, been asked this question from here at Leadership Tulsa in the past. I've been asked it when I teach type rows. I've been asked it when I teach the chamber. Johnny, if a board member could only have one trait, what's the one trait all board members should have? And I say, they ask questions. And it can be as simple as, hey, why did so-and-so get 94 cell phone stipends 1 month, which isn't making sense to me? 2, when was the last time we did an evaluation? We evaluate our executive director every November. Fantastic, thank you. That's all I need to know. So don't hesitate to ask those questions. That's the true hallmark of a great board member, somebody who's gonna ask questions. Number 9, set solid policies that properly govern the organization. Now, it may seem commonsensical, but I had to actually go back in and add the word solid and properly to this sentence, because some people are like, oh, we have a policy in place, but never think to ask, is it a good one? Is it a smart one? Now, policies are board decisions, and a policy can be something like, hey, we're going to start doing background checks on volunteers as well as staff members. That's not just an HR issue. That's a budget issue. It's a culture issue. It's a recruitment issue. What is a volunteer? Somebody who's once a week, once a year, somebody shows up once? We need to define these things. So we want to set those policies that are solid. They make sense moving forward for the betterment of the organization. The sole purpose of a board, to make legally binding decisions in the best interest of the organization to help govern it moving it forward. So we need those solid policies that properly govern the organization. What gets a lot of, so when you become a board member, not as an entrance, but as a board member, you have to follow 3 duties the IRS lays out: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience is what they're called. The duty of obedience says, hey, you have to obey all federal, state, municipal laws and your own bylaws. And what gets most nonprofits into trouble is boards aren't even aware policies are in place. Usually term limits or something that isn't as impactful right away, but can be long-term. And it happens all the time. I'll say, hey, do you guys have a diversity policy? No, we don't have one. And somebody on the board will go, well, I think maybe we do. Maybe we did that 3 or 4 years ago. If you have to take down your policies and dust them off and there's a big cloud like Pigpen from Peanuts, then you're probably not really adhering to them to begin with. So make sure, a great moving guideline, every 3 years, evaluate your mission. Every 3 years, evaluate your bylaws. Every 3 years, evaluate your policies. And you can rotate them, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But ask yourself, is this policy still important? Or are we lacking? A lot of organizations don't have a diversity policy, or they do, but they don't have an equity or an inclusion policy. And we're starting to understand people, even from funders who want to invest in your community impact, to people who just want to say, here's an extra 5. People are asking these questions. Do you have a plan in place if this situation were to arise? And it can be, again, something as a gift acceptance policy. Hey, if there's a gift of has a value of more than $500, we need to have the board approve that first. This is a true story. I was working at the Greenwood Cultural Center. Our annual budget was about $250,000. And I got a call from somebody who wanted to write a $100,000 check to the organization. Director of development, I'd only been there like 6 weeks. I was like, this is easy, I got this. Life isn't getting better. And the person explained what the situation was, and I had to go to my board and say, hey, we have somebody who wants to give us $100,000. And they said, who is it? And I said, you're gonna laugh, but Donald Trump is gonna run for president. He apparently wants to help secure the African-American vote. He knows that the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, it was called the Tulsa Race Riot at the time, is gonna be occurring, hopefully in the middle of his term, so he wants to launch things here. And the board had to have some tough decisions and say, we didn't feel like his particular agenda matched the mission of the Greenwood Cultural Center, so they opted to decline the check.
This is really a true story.
It really is, yes. In fact,
wow.
If you guys remember, and I told them, I can't do this. I used to work at the Mabee Center. If you want to call Tony Winters, and President Trump, former President Trump, went over and had his rally at the Mabee Center instead of at the Greenwood Cultural Center. But it's tough. When we see $100,000, who wouldn't want to take the money? But sometimes having that policy in place, which the Greenwood Cultural Center did, made it easier on me to go, hey, this policy's in place, meant that it was properly moving forward in all circumstances, not just in 1 or 2. That is a true story. Now, he said that there were 19,000 people at the Mabee Center rally, and the Mabee Center only holds 11,500. I didn't push that part, but both parts of that story are true. Number 10, Create a good experience for members. Send out materials ahead of time, establish engaging meetings, and facilitate meetings well. So this is going to happen if you serve on more than 1 or 2 boards in your entire career. At some point, you're going to be on a board where the materials are given to you as you walk in the door, and you're voting on a budget. 10 minutes later, you haven't even had the chance to review or digest. That's not best practice. Best practice is a week in advance. The Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits sends our board packets out 10 days in advance. But what happens is we say, hey, everybody, Zach Orr is going to be joining the board. Zach, tell us about yourself. And Zach says, oh, I'm Zach. I really have a passion to the mission. And Zach sits down, and literally 10 minutes later, he's voting on programs he's not familiar with, a budget he's never seen, doesn't understand the dynamics in the room because nobody took the time to orient him properly. So make sure that those materials are sent out ahead of time. Those meetings are engaging. And I can tell you right now, if a meeting is engaging for an organization, I'll look back at about the last 6 or 7 board meeting minutes. And if it's nothing but 15-0 votes all the time, that's not an engaging meeting. And don't get me wrong, 8-7 votes all the time isn't particularly healthy either. Sometimes you got to table stuff and move on. But a good facilitator, which is the board chair, the role of the board chair, is to be the one to say, hey, Jennifer, I know you had some reservations on this a couple months ago. How do you feel about it today? Pamela, you haven't contributed to the conversation. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this are. Everybody needs to be engaged, not just in terms of their long-term service and feeling that connection, but feeling comfortable speaking up. The biggest challenge a board chair has is making people feel welcome. But if a board chair does that and people feel comfortable speaking up, really, really great things start to happen. And then lastly, of course, that's facilitating meetings well. We've all been called to the 1-hour meeting that we got out of 3 hours and 15 minutes later. You're like, holy moly, what was that all about? Or you walk in and you say, hey, can I get a copy of our budget? And somebody hands you the operating instructions for the International Space Station that you're supposed to weed through and try to find the line item you need. No, make it pleasant on board members. You know what board members care about is the budget. What did we budget? How close are we to it? How are we year to date? Maybe versus last year. The budget committee is going to go through line item by line item. Budget members or board members as a whole just want to know the big picture. Do we need to make adjustments? If it's a 1 or 2% variance, probably not. 10%, yeah, we may need to. Hey, COVID-19 is going to be a real thing. Funders are saying capacity may be reduced at the end of the year. What do we need to do to plan for that? So if you're doing these things, if you're creating a good experience for your board members, not only does the sustainability and the long-term recruitment plans and the succession plans take care of themselves, but it means you're not going to wind up having 4 or 5 board members roll off every term, and you have to start from ground zero time and time again.
Not that you say that, you know, the board president or chairman of the board, chairperson of the board is really the one responsible. I will say there's kind of a partnership with that executive director, and that executive director can be a resource in figuring that out. We use the POP meeting sometimes as a way to think about what's the purpose of this meeting, what are the outcomes we need, and then what's the process, which for our board meeting really becomes the agenda. And we've added things to as many of our board meetings as we can, where we put people in breakout groups to have a discussion and bring back some feedback. Which kind of makes the meeting a little more lively than just hearing reports and having votes. It's really something that you need to be thoughtful about. And I think a lot of people just show up and assume the meeting will run itself. But it's important that both the chief volunteer officer and the chief staff officer are thinking about how do we run this meeting in a way that'll both get us what we need and be engaging and helpful for the board.
Definitely. I will tell you, here at the center, I teach a 3-hour class just about board meetings. It's not Robert's rules. It's, hey, how to have an engaging meeting, how to make the most out of everybody's time. And that partnership between the president or CEO, the executive director, and the board chair is so crucial. We have a class on that that's free. And only our board chair, who is Carlos Johnson now, and Marnie Williams, our president and CEO, can teach it. Only board chairs and president CEOs or executive directors can attend. And it's that relationship is so crucial that we say, hey, it's free. And you start off with questions as simple as, how do you like to communicate? Via email, through text, how often should we communicate? And we progress through, this is what we want our legacy to be and how we're going to achieve that. So I can't stress the importance of the partnership between the board chair and the executive director enough. That's a great point. Thank you. And then our next to last slide, hey, if you want to be a great board member and you're not sure how, if you're like me and you can't write $5 million checks 3 or 4 times a week, I just wanted to throw a quick 21 ideas, everything from suggesting new board members. I love this phone and I love COVID times because you can pick this up and talk for 45 seconds about why you love your organization and put it on Facebook and people will share it for you. You can sign a thank you card. You can say, hey, you know what? I don't have a lot of money to give, but I'd love to make 10 phone calls to donors just saying thank you. Donors love that. That whole stewardship, that attitude of gratitude is a big difference maker. You can go on asks. You can set up a Google alert. Hey, I'm going to work with Leadership Tulsa. Google alert. Anytime Leadership Tulsa comes up, I want to get a Google report of every link that it's mentioned on each day. So I'm going to stay abreast with the activities just as quickly as if Wendy literally had to pick me up and call me every day to tell me what was going on. I'm going to send this presentation to Wendy. She'll be able to send it out to everybody so you'll have a digital copy. But feel free to look back at this board and ask, hey, is there something I can be doing? Or this slide and ask if there's something you can be doing as a board member. Lastly, that's my direct line and my direct email. Please reach out to me if you have any questions. If you don't want to have to write anything down, Wendy has my contact information as well. And I'd love to answer any questions you may have. With that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So get ready for that little resize. And if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to I haven't been looking at the chat, but if you have any questions or thoughts in our last couple minutes, I wouldn't mind hearing them right now.
Yeah, we have one question that was sent to me, which is a resource or good book on board service. She's on a small board and they don't have a lot of money to bring in someone to facilitate with them. I will mention that a lot of Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits classes are very affordable, and that you also offer some scholarship support, if I remember correctly. But you also sent me a bibliography. Board Source was a source that you had mentioned.
Board Source is a board. There's a couple that I actually keep these with me. One is called the Nonprofit Board Answer Book. That's a pretty good reference. One is the 3 Signs of a Miserable Job. You probably heard of Peter Lencioni. He's kind of the modern day Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker was a nonprofit management guru in the 70s and 80s. And then the last book I recommend is, I think it's called Managing a Nonprofit, that Peter Drucker wrote. It's still kind of the go-to standard. And pretty much chapters that are based on a single slide here that kind of goes into further on the concepts. And I obviously can go into more detail if you'd like, but there's a couple good recommendations, and I can resend that book list if you'd like to.
That'd be great. And you all offer a program called Standards of Excellence, which I think is another great primer. It's a little more intensive than just a class, but you walk away with all of the basic policies and documentations that a good board should have in place.
Yes, I will tell you, our Standards for Excellence class, we actually lead the world. Oklahoma has more people complete Standards for Excellence in a year than even Maryland, where the program was founded. And Standards is just an international ethics and accountability code for nonprofits. After the whole Enron debacle, they said, hey, we need to put some best practices in place. But the joy of Standards for Excellence, when you leave, you get a flash drive, and it has about 600 different policies and policy templates on it, 300 of which are specific to Oklahoma that the Attorney General has already vetted, so you can apply them to use. The other 300 are national and international versions of the same. So if there's a policy you need, or Johnny, can I get a social media policy, or a cannabis in the workplace policy, or a volunteer policy, just reach out to me, because we've got plenty of those. I can even send you a Word version, so you can just copy and paste. You don't have to
That's awesome.
at all.
Yeah. So we have a question, curiosity about why you mentioned that compensation and performance evaluation would or wouldn't be tied together. And I will actually say that when it was recommended to me that the performance evaluation conversation with my direct reports be separated from the compensation conversation, it actually made them go so much better, because you could really lean in with curiosity, and everyone wasn't just waiting for bated breath, do I or do I not get an increase? And in my organization, that's also because sometimes people can be deserving of increases when there isn't budget to provide them, or sometimes people take on new responsibilities, which necessitate increases. So that's kind of why in my organization, we've untied them. It doesn't mean that how well they perform doesn't figure into compensation, but it's two separate conversations. So that's my take on it. But what would you say to Clay about that?
You know, we take a pretty straightforward approach. Anybody we hire, we expect is going to be phenomenal at their job. And our compensation level is tied into the job description. If they aren't phenomenal, we're going to assume the onus is on the organization and we need to give them the resources or the training or the correction plan or whatever it may be to be phenomenal. So if somebody isn't going to be the best person for the position, we're not going to hire them. If they are going to be the best person for the position, then they need to be paid appropriate to that. Now, at the same time, the first time I had my annual review here, came from the older model of if you get X amount of points, it's a 3% increase or whatever it may be. And I was fairly nervous because I hadn't worked for other organizations for too long. I'd been in the nonprofit sector about 5 years. And as when Kim, who's my supervisor, said, oh, just so you're aware, this doesn't tie into compensation. That's already been decided. I was like, oh, well, in that case, let's have an open and honest conversation because I do want to move forward with it. But when you separate the two and folks realize that, it not only lets your team know, hey, we're hiring the best people. We expect you to be the best. We're going to give you the best resources to do that. But it's also sending that message. We're interested in everybody's long-term development. We can dig a little deeper. We can be a little more curious, ask more questions, because that it doesn't really matter if you're me or Wendy or Rebecca or Dylan or Jennifer. We all have to pay our bills and money does factor in. It's a budgetary issue and a job description issue. The expectation of exceedingly well performance is already in the equation. We just need to make sure we're giving them the resources to be able to do that. That's our approach on it anyway.
That's great. And I guess for so many of you who are going out to maybe your first board position, maybe an intern position, just to remind you that the intern position is going to be a non-voting position, but it's a great place to begin to watch. And does every organization do all 10 of these things great? I doubt it. You know, there's probably great boards that rock 8 of them and could improve into, to Johnny's great quote about if you know you're good, you know you can be better. But it's a great opportunity for you as you enter into board service to watch leadership in action. You know, when challenges arise, how do the leaders address it? Do they have that firm foundation that they've built their organization on, which is really good policies and practices, really open dialogue? Or if you see that we're stumbling, what about that foundation is causing those stumbles? So being curious, and as a leader going out into these boards, know that they all kind of get through this differently, even though their basic responsibilities are the same from organization to organization. So part of it's just finding the right fit for you as well.
Exactly right. And I think 2020 was really an amplifier. If you didn't have great policies and a good board in place, these issues were really amplified and you faced much larger hurdles. Whereas if you had a great board in place and great policies, you were probably able to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic a little bit easier than some other organizations. So why not just have everything in place that you need just in case something were to happen? Mm-hmm. But I think, Wendy, that was a great summation of it. Yeah, no board that I know of does everything perfectly. I haven't met one yet, but I do know boards who are still working on it and are getting better each day because they're still working on it. That's what we care about.
So true. Well, we are at the hour, so I think that'll be a wrap. So tomorrow I will be sending out an email with the recording with a couple of resources that we've mentioned today with your slides, if you'll send them to me. And the resources, I'm going to send our board self-evaluation tool and a sample board commitment statement. I might just send you Leadership Tulsa's. And then there will also be a link. If you are participating in required training for your board internship, you'll want to take a very quick survey that just confirms your participation. So with that, thank you, Johnny, for spending tonight with us. And
thank you.
Looking forward to Class 64's retreat this weekend. So we'll see a lot of you very soon. Next month, Johnny, do you remember offhand what next month is? Is it finance next month?
I didn't even remember February had 2 R's till about 4 o'clock this afternoon. So no, I don't, but I will look it up and I'll send it to you with the slides. I'll let you know who it will be next month.
And I think I've got that note too. So I'll send everybody a reminder of next month. So we hope you join us again. Have a great evening. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.